Welcome to episode 168 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's April 17, 1971. Gelsenkirchen. Schalke 04 against Arminia Bielefeld. On the surface, it's just another Bundesliga match in the spring run-in. A mid-table giant against a club fighting for survival. But in the 83rd minute, Gerd Roggensack scores for Bielefeld, Schalke lose 1-0, and German football quietly crosses the line. Because this match would later come to be seen not simply as a bad result or a strange result, but as the key entry point into the biggest scandal in Bundesliga history. A scandal so vast that it swallowed more than 50 players, reached into roughly half the league, distorted a relegation battle, wrecked careers, crushed public trust, and gave Schalke a nickname they still haven't fully shaken: FC Meineid, FC Perjury. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the beginning of the Bundesliga itself. West Germany launched the Bundesliga in 1963. It was meant to professionalize and centralize elite football, to replace their fragmented regional structure, and to give the country a modern national league worthy of its talent. And by the end of the 1960s, that is exactly what it was becoming. The national team were runners-up at the 1966 World Cup, third at the 1970 World Cup, and on their way to becoming the dominant side in Europe. At club level, the standard was rising too. Bayern München and Borussia Mönchengladbach were dragging German football upward, together, title after title, star after star, raising both the quality and the commercial stakes of the league. That is the shiny part of the story. The darker part sat underneath. There was still no second Bundesliga. If you went down, you fell back into the old Regionalliga structure. That meant less money, less prestige, less visibility, and a much harder road back. Relegation was not just a sporting disappointment, it was an economic cliff's edge. And once the money in the Bundesliga started to rise, the fear of falling out rose with it. By the spring of 1971, that fear was everywhere near the bottom of the table. Rot-Weiß Essen were in serious trouble. So were Kickers Offenbach, Arminia Bielefeld, Rot-Weiß Oberhausen, and for a while, Eintracht Frankfurt as well. This was precisely the kind of environment in which corruption grows. Some clubs desperate, other clubs safe, and too many players willing to treat one spring afternoon as a financial opportunity. That is the setting for the Schalke match. Bielefeld, battling relegation, paid 40,000 Deutschmarks for help in Gelsenkirchen. Broken down by player, it was roughly 2,500 marks each. The winning goal came late. Roggensack in the 83rd minute. Bielefeld took the points. Schalke took the stain. At the time, it was just one result in a crowded relegation fight. Later, it became emblematic, because Schalke's players denied it emphatically, denied it under oath. And when that oath collapsed, the nickname was born. It was perjury. So FC Meineid. But this was not just the Schalke story. That is one of the most important things to understand about the 1971 scandal. It was not one rogue dressing room. It was a marketplace. Clubs fighting relegation tried to buy results directly. They tried to buy opposing players. They tried to buy win bonuses for third teams. Goalkeepers named their price. Intermediaries carried envelopes. Some matches were fixed successfully. Some were bought unsuccessfully. Some were not thrown outright, but were still illegally influenced by payment offers. The best-known chain ran through Schalke against Bielefeld on April 17. Köln against Rot-Weiß Essen on May 5, Offenbach against Oberhausen on May 8, Köln against Oberhausen and Duisburg against Bielefeld on May 22nd, and then Bielefeld against Stuttgart and Offenbach against Frankfurt on May 29, and on the final day, Braunschweig against Oberhausen, Hertha against Bielefeld, and Köln against Offenbach. This was massive. Some of the sums were startling. Köln goalkeeper Manfred Manglitz wanted 25,000 marks before facing Essen. Or, as he said, a few things might happen. That is, of course, he would let Essen score. Duisburg's Gerhard Kenschke took 60,000 from Bielefeld, though Duisburg still won. Before Hertha against Bielefeld, Offenbach tried to buy a Hertha win for 140,000, only to discover that Bielefeld's side had already gone higher for a Hertha defeat. Around Köln against Offenbach, Manglitz demanded 100,000 for himself and others. This was not subtle corruption. It was open rate corruption. And then came June 6, 1971. Horst-Gregorio Canellas, president of Kickers Offenbach, turned 50 and invited journalists, football officials, and prominent guests to his garden party. Even national team coach Helmut Schön was there. Just before lunch, Canellas played tapes of the phone calls he had secretly recorded. That was a detonation. Not a police raid, not a confession to the Federation, and not a newspaper sting, but a birthday party. The tapes made clear that major figures in the Bundesliga had been talking about board matches as if they were negotiating freight prices. And what made it even more explosive was the hypocrisy. Canellas himself was no innocent outsider. He had also tried to buy results to save Offenbach. He was a whistleblower and participant at the same time. By then, the table was already finished. Borussia Mönchengladbach were champions again. Bayern were right there behind them, and German football at the top looked stronger than ever. But at the bottom, the table was poisoned. Bielefeld survived in 14th on 29 points. Oberhausen survived in 16th on 27. Offenbach went down in 17th, level on points with Oberhausen, but behind on goal difference. Essen went down as well. That mattered enormously, because the bribed matches still counted. The table stood. The damage was real. And at the heart of it sat those bored Bielefeld wins, especially the 3 1-0 victories against Schalke, Stuttgart, and Hertha. So what did this scandal actually become? It became enormous. Hans Kindermann, the DFB prosecutor, uncovered a network that reached more than 50 players, 2 coaches, and 6 club officials. The most heavily hit clubs included Hertha BSC and Eintracht Braunschweig, with 15 punished players each, and Schalke with 13. This was not a fringe operation. It touched internationals, major clubs, and some of the league's best-known names. Klaus Fischer was involved. So was Klaus Fichtel. So was Reinhard Libuda. So was Rolf Rüssmann. So was Bernd Patzke. So was Manglitz. This was why the scandal cut so deep. The faces were familiar, and some of them belonged to the future of German football. The punishments were severe on paper. Lifetime bans were handed out. Fischer's was later reduced. Fichtel was later pardoned. Libuda came back. Manglitz, banned for life, later received clemency too. Many others saw suspensions shortened or removed altogether. Critics would argue for years that the authorities moved too fast when handing out broad judgments, and too slowly in fully cleaning the thing up, and too conveniently once the 1974 World Cup on home soil came into view. That contradiction is central to the scandal. The reaction was both brutal and incomplete. Offenbach lost its license, though it had already been relegated on the field. Bielefeld were allowed to play the whole 1971-72 Bundesliga season before finally being forcibly relegated a year later in April 1972. Schalke's perjury cases dragged on even longer, and in 1975 several of the players were convicted in court for lying under oath. That is how the nickname stuck, not just because the match had been sold, but because the denial had been true, and the league paid for it. Attendances collapsed, trust drained away. The DFB itself later described a drop of more than 800,000 spectators in the season after the scandal broke. Crowds that should have been swelling in a golden age of West German football instead shrank. At exactly the moment when the national team was becoming brilliant and the Bundesliga should have been cashing in on that quality, the public started wondering whether the table meant anything at all. In the longer run, German football did recover. Euro 1972 and then the 1974 World Cup helped restore the game's prestige. Structural reform mattered too. The second professional tier, the second Bundesliga, finally arrived in 1974, in part because the old drop from Bundesliga to Regionalliga had created exactly the kind of desperation that fed the scandal. And some of the players came back to build major careers anyway. That may be the most unsettling part of all. Klaus Fischer returned and became one of the great Bundesliga scorers. Klaus Fichtel came back too, and eventually set extraordinary longevity standards, including being the oldest player, 43 years, to appear in the Bundesliga. Others, like Manglitz, never truly repaired the damage. Volkmar Groß lost what might have been a World Cup place. And Schalke, even when it moved on, could never fully leave 1971 behind. Because German football remembers. Not every scandal earns a nickname that lasts for generations. This one did. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 17, 1971. First, the Schalke Bielefeld match mattered not because it was the only fixed game, but because it became the symbolic doorway into the whole Bundesliga scandal. Second, The scandal was driven by structure as much as greed, rising money at the top, no proper second tier below, and a relegation battle that made survival financially priceless. And third, the consequences were huge. Distorted relegation, more than 50 players punished, reputations destroyed, attendances damaged, and a crisis serious enough to help force structural reform in German football. On this day in 1971, Arminia Bielefeld beat Schalke 1-0 in a match later exposed as sport, a result that helped trigger the Bundesliga's greatest corruption scandal and earned Schalke the bitter nickname FC Meineid. That's all for episode 168 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by a 17 lost guy. Tomorrow, we go back just 5 years to April 18, 2021, when the European Super League was announced during COVID and when the backlash began almost immediately. See you then.